So welcome back to the next part of the tutorial where I'm going to be going through the three-quarter view sketch, rendering that up and using that as to explain more information to somebody that might do a 3D model of it, or just to give more information for myself, just to figure out the design more. So anyways, here I am. I'm using the hard round brush in Photoshop, probably the main brush that I use most of the time. One of the brushes that really I like the hard edge that it gives you when you color in stuff. It doesn't leave that kind of soft airbrush look that I see happen a lot on digital renderings. I think when somebody's learning how to do digital renderings, they tend to use that soft airbrush, and it can look kind of sloppy and messy. So to kind of correct that, you try using the hard edge brush. That helps out quite a bit. So I'm just going in and laying in my colors. Basically, like I said before when I did the side view rendering, laying in kind of a mid-tone. Even my blacks for my wheels aren't totally solid black. And the reason is that you can render from light. You can render from the medium tones to light, or the medium tones to dark tones. So you get this so you don't want to lay down a solid black for your wheels, because you're going to have color variations in that. Just touching a little bit on color. Obviously, there's a lot to color theory and things like that. Although it's not super complicated, but when you lay down a color, and you're rendering an object that's in an environment, um, you don't you don't ever get one solid color. Like a wheel. If you look at a wheel or a tire outside, it's not solid black. You wouldn't just squeeze out a tube of paint and paint a solid black tire down there. You would actually look at it, and you would have light hitting it. You'd have reflections hitting it. So you're going to get, dark tones and light tones all over that tire. So you're not getting just a solid black. And even a solid black on a tire is very rare. It tends to have a blue hint, or even sometimes a red hint to it. So, but when I do stuff for design, I tend to use, if it's a tire, I'll do it a darker gray, or something that doesn't have much color in it. And then I will, later on, as I go through the process, I will add a little bit of color to it to vary the surfaces. So what I'm doing here is I'm creating the paths that go around the wheels to give myself a clean wheel. This is one thing when you do a three-quarter rendering, to really you need paths to give yourself a nice crisp edge for the wheels. Whereas on the side view, you saw me create just a solid round brush and create a circle right there. But when you're in three-quarter, I use the paths a lot to clean up my wheels. And that's a big secret behind, doing car renderings. You always want your wheels to be solid, or not solid, but a nice, crisp, well-rendered wheel will always make your final rendering look so much nicer than if you just leave it as a sketch. Whereas when you're rendering your wheel in a sketch form, you won't be able to get that perfect ellipse that you need. And you can kind of see my where I drew with the the drawing tool through my wheels. So I lined up my edges, or my ellipses on those lines that are drawn through my wheels. That gives me a guide basically to lay my ellipses on. I explain wheels quite a bit in my first book, where I talk about the major and minor axis. I even have it on my YouTube channel. So if you're ever want to know a little bit more about drawing wheels in perspective, look up my YouTube channel, and it's Future Elements is the name of the YouTube channel. Now, right now, what I'm discovering that my proportions are off on my 3D or my three-quarter sketch. So what I do is I circled the cockpit to show where I was noticing some variations on my three-quarter sketch versus the side view. So what I did is I laid down wheels. You can see the circles that I drew in between my wheels. So there's about approximately a 4 wheel space in between the front wheel and the back wheel. So then I proceeded to draw those same wheels on my three-quarter sketch to really get the proportions right. And I noticed that my back wheel is actually not pushed back far enough. But right now I'm going in and adjusting some of the lines for the cockpit area to make it match the side view sketch better. I was noticing that it was kind of popping up too much in that like center area of the cockpit. I could tell was too short on my three-quarter view versus the side view. Then I'm also removing some of the details that I had done on that lower three-quarter sketch just to make it match the side view. I'm kind of figuring out some areas that need to change in the three-quarter sketch. But sometimes, you throw down a quick sketch just to give yourself an idea, and then, to really finalize it, you want to go back and check out your proportions and stuff like that. And this is the best way to check out your proportions is using the wheel reference like I showed there. So this is a really cool feature that they added in Photoshop CS4 was you can actually spin the canvas. Painters had it for a long time, but they finally added it to Photoshop, and it's a great function. Because when I was drawing that arc, I couldn't. Sometimes it's funky when you leave it straight. So when you sketch in a sketchbook, you're always turning the sketchbook to get your lines lined up right and just some nice crisp lines while you're drawing them. So you spin the canvas to get a nice arc on that. So right now I'm getting ready to adjust a few things on that lower sketch to fix it to match the side view. And like I said, some of the stuff that needs to change is the rear wheel is too close to the front. You can even tell by looking at the engine area on that three-quarter sketch compared to the top one how squashed it's looking. So I need to go in there and fix some of this stuff. And I'm just drawing a few guidelines for myself to get this figured out right now. And the wheels up there too needed to get kicked out a little bit more, not so close. And I was also noticing the front wheel was a little bit too big. And how you can tell is I drew a straight line from the top of my wheel on the side view drawing. I drew a straight line from the top of the wheel to the back of the cockpit, and I was seeing where it lines up and realized that front wheel was a little too tall, so I needed to shrink it down a little bit. So just drawing some more guidelines for myself, getting this figured out. But it's a great way, it's a little bit of mistake on my part, but you can also see how I work. And, a lot of times the best artists out there will make mistakes. It's how they correct them and how they finalize the piece is what really separates them from a professional and an amateur. So just realizing that my drawing was not right and I need to go in and fix it instead of just leaving it. And the reason you want to fix this stuff, if you're trying to do designs for a video game or a movie or even a toy, you want your proportions to look right in that three-quarter view compared to the side view. Because sometimes, if a modeler's modeling it, they're like, well, which detail do you want? Do you want the one on the 3/4 view, or do you want the one on the side view? And you don't want, the last thing as a designer that you want to do is confuse somebody, because that's your job, is to know this stuff. You're designing it, so you need to figure it out and show the correct proportions and get the right scale and things like that and your right details. But this is another beauty about working digitally, is you can chop up this stuff and correct your drawing as you go along. If you were drawing this traditionally, normally what we would do is uh, either use tracing paper or vellum or something like that. And um, a lot of times, the stuff that I'm doing here with the scaling and skewing and things like that, you'd have to redraw that completely. But a lot of times you can draw pieces and actually put them back over the top of your drawing and assemble them if you were working traditionally. We used to do that quite a bit. But also, another big thing too is mileage. A lot of people ask, how do you get good at drawing? And it really is mileage. I mean, it's a lot of drawing. When we were in school, we would do, uh, you know, 30, 40 pages of sketches a week, and then, anywhere from usually about 10 to 20 renderings a week too. So you were just putting on the mileage. And even still, I still try to draw quite a bit. And as you draw more and more, your eye gets used to things and you figure out stuff, and it doesn't quite take as much thought anymore. But part of drawing all the times, I realized that my proportions were not right, and then I used techniques to show me what my proportions needed to be. And then right now I'm trying to get this scoop figured out, get the right perspective on it. It was a little too low compared to what that top view sketch is. But you can see that, sometimes you got to go in and adjust stuff as you're working. Um, and like I said, the original 3/4 drawing I'd drawn for this was a real quick sketch. So you can see I've had to move around quite a bit of stuff on there. Wheels, the engine. I had to bring the engine back a little bit more so it wasn't so squashed to the front of the car. So just going in and redrawing some of the details that got cut out. And starting to get there now, though. Starting to look a lot better. A lot more like the top drawing, like the top side view rendering. So going in and just basically getting it all back to like it was, all the details figured out and stuff like that. So I pretty much got the majority back in, so I'll start rendering again. Again, going with that hard edge flat brush. Definitely got a few layers going here now, partly because I've got so many, I cut out so many pieces on the sketch right there. And I'll definitely put it I'll merge it all to one layer again, redoing the shadow. So you can see how I really lengthened out that car in the back just by making the wheel a little bit smaller in the rear, and also stretching out that, kind of spacing that engine away from the body in the front. So I'm just going through, and here we go. I'm going to group all this together now, get this all cleaned up. Like I said before, I really don't like using a lot of layers. It gets real confusing, and It's hard to keep track of when you want to turn stuff off and on. You got to go through all this stuff. Even when you label it, it just gets real tedious. Especially for this level of rendering that I'm doing right now, it's not necessary to do all that to keep it in so many layers. If I was doing a like a real tight rendering, then I do leave it in layers just because you need to sometimes go back and correct stuff. And it's much easier if it's in a layer than if it's all put together. But for this kind of rendering, like I said, I try to group it all together just to keep it simple and clean for myself. So finally progressing now on the rendering side of stuff after correcting the sketch and getting it laid out right. The last thing you want to do is spend a long time on a rendering and figure out that it's all messed up as far as proportions are concerned. Because a lot of time wasted. When you see that sketch turn white, basically what it is originally I had drawn the sketch on a white background and put it over the top of this textured paper stuff, and then I hit the multiply on the layer palette, and what that does is the multiply takes out the white from the sketch. A lot of people know that, but I'm just explaining it if you didn't already. Then the other thing I do too is once I get most of my color laid down and kind of establish the midtones and stuff, I start to lighten up my sketch there. You saw me go over there and I adjusted the opacity on the layer palette just to get a little bit lighter so I can start seeing where my tones are going in. It also helps with laying out your details. When I tend to render, I usually will render to the point where I don't even need my line drawing anymore. I think when you do that, it really it gives volume to the object that you're rendering. Whereas if you leave the sketch, it still looks like a sketch, which that's no problem. I actually do that style as well. I'm sure most of you are familiar with it. I guess it just depends on what you want to achieve out of your final design. But right now, I'm doing it to create a 3D model basically out of. So the more stuff that you render and the more stuff that you define, it's easier for the modeler or even for yourself, because that's actually what the object is going to look like, when it's sitting there on the table or sitting on the road, I should say. So again, even in the vent areas, I use that dark gray instead of going straight to black. Eventually it'll go straight to black, but I just render that way because that way it gives you some choices and some options to take the color either way. Like even when I do my reds here, I don't want to go for the brightest red you can get, because you want to be able to take that, into a dark red and into a lighter red so that you can get your highlights on there and stuff. So, and I don't really cover a lot on actually using the program Photoshop. I guess I actually learned Photoshop basically on my own from just using the program all the time, which it seems like most people are like that anymore. When I was in school, it was kind of a fairly a new thing to actually render your stuff in Photoshop. Now it's kind of like the norm. But I just see it as another tool. I really think it is important to know traditional methods along with the digital stuff, because it really will make your digital stuff better. So right now I'm just kind of playing with the two different brushes. One is a hard-edged one, and it stays a solid color all the way through. Then that other one I used was it has an opacity setting on it, so the harder you push, the darker the color gets. And now I'm using the airbrush to lay down basically the lighter surface on top. Like you can see in that side view drawing up there where that break is in the body is actually facing the sky, so it's going to be brighter than the break on the bottom. So I'm just I basically got my colors to the point where I'm starting to add in the definition of the actual shapes. And so again, kind of going back to that whole thing I talked about with the tires, where you don't just lay down a solid black. Tires aren't solid black in real life. So this is same with the body. It's it's got that bend in it, so it's not going to be. And I'm thinking of metal while I'm drawing this too. It's not an actual color. So I pull up reference photos that I've collected throughout the years from going to air museums and stuff, and looking at how the metal is on those old planes, seeing how it's lit, seeing just how the metal bends and how it's lit, and just the different shading in the metal, what it really looks like. But anyways, back to talking about the color. So metal's a funky thing to render, but it's probably one of my favorite things to render, I think, because it is somewhat challenging. And there's so many different ways that you can render it. You can render it, kind of like Chrome, where you have the sky tone, so you have the blue up in the sky and then rolls around to usually like a brown ground tone. Or, you can do it kind of like I've done here in the side view, where it's a real bright hot spot, catching on the edge of that, and then rolls under and is reflecting the dark ground underneath it. So anyways, when you render metal, it really picks up a lot of your surroundings. So when you render metal, you kind of have to have in your head, what are the surroundings? What are they like? Is it on a cobblestone driveway, or is it sitting in the middle of the desert? Is it sitting on concrete? So when I do this one here, the whole premise of it is that it's a race car for the Bonneville Salt Flats. So it's actually sitting on white sand, but I actually rendered it more probably like it would be in the desert versus the white sand. I'm sorry, I said white sand, actually white salt. And sometimes, as a designer, you definitely got to take some design liberties in your own hands on how stuff would look, and what's going to best explain your object. Now, right here, what I did is I took that hard round brush and I'm changing the spacing, and I'm doing that so that I can draw rivets actually on the body without drawing the individual dots. So I just drag the brush across and it gives me that automatic spacing on there, and it looks like little rivets. So you can see where using custom brushes for different surfaces and stuff can really save time. And I actually drew these rivets on a different layer, so I can actually, what you do is you go over the top of it and you lock the opacity on there. And what that does is you can just render the rivets. It kind of acts like a mask. So you'll see me do that here, where I actually go over it with some lighter color to make it look like the light shining off the rivets. So continuing, putting in the dark areas on that side piece there. But again, like I said, I'm still using a dark gray instead of a black. So here I am with my wheels again, lining them up. You can see how I drew all the different ellipse template or the ellipse guides on there, so I can give myself some nice crisp wheels. Now what I'm doing is filling in the cockpit area for the glass, and what this will allow me to do is render the light and dark areas and kind of the reflective areas and stuff in there. And I'm using paths on here because I had flattened my whole canopy, so the ribs on there and the glass itself are all part of the same layer. So I just went in with the paths and selected it out, so I could go in and add the correct highlights and stuff like that. So I'm going in and using the color dodge brush. Oh, maybe not yet. I'm actually just highlighting it with the regular lighter color of that cockpit. Now here is the color dodge. And what that kind of represents is the the light along the horizon, and you have tones. You have the light reflecting off the backside of the glass, which highlights the glass. And then I just drew in the ground tone, and also drawn in the ground tone on the cockpit there on the top, because it's actually reflecting the other side. But you can see how when you start adding all these highlights and stuff like that, it really starts to make the form bend and shape. This here is I'm kind of rendering it too as if the brightest spot is actually on the horizon, which is actually what real life is. If you Even when the sun is straight up in the sky, you're going to have your horizon is going to be the brightest spot still, when you're rendering form. You will have hot spots from the sun above the horizon, but you're still going to have the brightest spot from your horizon on the actual object. So here I'm selecting kind of some of the tone I want for the metal. Again, using the color dodge brush. And getting forms to wrap around and to start to read. When I render some of the cores and stuff like that, this is when I definitely use the airbrush, the soft airbrush brush in Photoshop. Just starting to highlight some finer areas. And sometimes I go in and do this to start kind of define some areas so that I can see what's going on as far as how surfaces are facing up or facing down. See, just by adding those highlights to that the riveted cage around the canopy really pops it out from the glass, so it's not just flat against it. It's actually got a ridge going there. Give it some depth. And this all stems off looking at old World War II planes, just looking to see how this stuff is built. Going along with the design of how I would build this actual thing. So here I am going over the highlighted areas for the rivets. You can see how I'm making some of them pop out because they're catching the light different. Maybe they're turned in a different way and catching highlights from different areas. It's a great method though. Like I said, I rendered those, or I drew those out on a separate layer and left them there knowing that I was going to come back and highlight over the top of them. you can see how it's it's a process to go through all this stuff, and you have a lot of different materials that you're bringing together, and so each one is actually rendered in a different way. You have your metals, you have rubber, the tires are rubber, you have, like I said, the body's metal, and the cage around the canopy areas, different kind of metal. So you have a little different color there. And then you have the canopy itself. It's I'm kind of rendering up like as if it was like a almost like a mirror type finish, kind of like from sunglasses and stuff. Kind of, and it's rendered more like a modern cockpit instead of an old cockpit. So kind of combining the old with the new and the new with the old. Just like the front of this car would have an F1 style suspension. And just knowing how stuff is put together and how it actually works. And you get to know that from looking at a lot of photos and going to races and things like that. And if you're drawing vehicles like this, more than likely you're pretty interested in them, so you're going to look at them at shows and other events that you go to. So not only am I adding highlights and stuff to the canopy, but I'm actually adding some transparency qualities to it, because you would actually be able to see some of the details inside the cockpit. Right here is the back of the seat where the driver would sit, put his head against. And then you'd even have highlights and dark areas behind that glass. So that's what really creates this transparency look to it. And then you can see that I actually created that part of the cage area on the other side of the glass. So going through and just checking all my layers, seeing what I can group together and get rid of so I don't have a mess going again. And then one of the other reasons I group my layers together too is when I go in and use the color dodge brush, you need to have all your layers together so that it brings out all the color in the object below the brush. Because if you go over it on a separate layer, it'll draw it kind of strange. You'll have like a darker color and it just doesn't flow right. So you want to group all your layers together where you're creating the color dodge over, so that it's bringing out all those colors in that same layer. And you can see that I'm just bringing out that scoop in the back, putting a darker edge along the highlighted area just to define it. So now I go over and start to add some of the highlights. So here I pick up another brush that kind of adds some texture to the body, as if it was, had, run on the salt or the sand, and the sand scraped across the metal, so it created these, striations in it. So kind of scratching the surface is what it's doing. And it's this brush that I have that creates these really fine lines. If you make the brush really small, you can't even see the lines, but if you make it big, you can kind of see it creates these scratches on the metal. It's a really great brush. So now I'm going in and starting to add some of the detail area underneath the scoop there, as if they were kind of maybe stacks coming out of the engine, intake stacks, which are like the little carburetors, and that's how the air gets into the engine, comes through that scoop and into the intakes. Now I'm gonna do the pipes, and I kind of went with these pipes that had this titanium texture to them. You've seen the pipes on like tuner cars and things like that that they flame the titanium and it turns them these purplish blue colors, even some yellow in them and stuff. So I wanted to just replicate that to kind of give it that titanium look that had been burned. So you can see how I'm doing. I'm laying a dark base of dark blue there, and then I go in and add the cores, which is basically, this is like rendering a cylinder. And then go in and add the cores, and then you come back over the final pass over the top, which really brings it out as this light, kind of go with a light purple or light blue, and you put it on color dodge. And then when you come out with that, and it adds that purpley blue color to the whole thing, it's pretty cool. It's a great method on creating that kind of burned titanium look. So right now I actually did the dark blue and then I added some of the purple in there. Then I go over it with the color dodge so that you get that color variation in there. So you can see, I mean, it's actually a really simple thing to do. I mean, you get the darker color on there, and then you add in your dark core, and then you add in a little bit of lighter color with the two different colors, and then go over it with the color dodge, and you've got that kind of burned titanium look. So yeah, learning how to render different materials is definitely, I really enjoy that part of rendering. Sometimes I'll look at stuff when I see it in a photo or even in real life and go, man, how would I render that on the computer, or even with marker, or even with pencil or something. So this almost is going to conclude the first part of the 3/4 rendering, and we'll be moving on to the second part and finishing up all the details and making this thing look complete. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next tutorial.